We got one more. My bad. Got ahead of myself, sorry.
You know, last week we began looking at the book of Lamentations and its application for today. And if you recall, I said that the book serves as a warning. And the warning is that although God is long-suffering, there will come a point of no return for any nation that turns their back on him. And that is evidently true as we look over the many examples in history. I also said that the book of Lamentations serves as an encouragement. Even though a nation comes under the chastening hand of God, there is still mercy and grace for those who trust in him. And this was clearly seen in the case of Jeremiah. We saw in his attitude. He was in a bad place, but he knew where his hope and his contentment rested. He was wise. Now, as a reminder, Lamentations was written by the weeping prophet Jeremiah. He wrote it shortly after Jerusalem was conquered by the Babylonians in 587, 586 BC. Now, Jeremiah was sent by God to warn the people of Judah to turn back to him or suffer severe consequences. They did not believe him. The leadership did not believe him. They would not listen to any prophet who did not say the things that they wanted to hear. But none of this mattered to Jeremiah. he continued being faithful in delivering God's warnings to them. And because of that, they considered him to be an enemy of the state. They went so far as to charge him with treason. They also put God to the test. And so he followed through with what he had warned them about. And they were conquered. The Babylonians came in and destroyed the city of Jerusalem. Countless lives were lost. Lives that could have been spared had they only listened to the warnings. Now the story picks up here in Lamentations chapter 3 with Jeremiah assessing the situation around him. The Babylonians had just laid waste to their beloved city. They looted it and they burnt it to the ground. And Jeremiah is now living in the aftermath of this. He sees and describes the utter misery and desperation of a people that were nearly consumed in God's wrath. They were warned but had refused to listen. And now they were paying a very, very heavy price. I closed last week by presenting a parallelism between Judah and the United States. We are without a doubt repeating history here. Like Judah, we are also a nation under God. We were founded by men who left an oppressive government, who then came here and formed a government under biblical principles. That is why we have freedoms here that exist nowhere else in the world. The book of Lamentations serves as a warning for the U.S., because our country could replicate that of Judah. We're not a pagan nation, and therefore God will hold us to a higher degree of accountability. Because of that, we're without excuse. And if we don't return to some semblance of sanity and common sense, we too will pay a heavy price. Our passage for this morning deals with the hurt and the wrongdoing that Jeremiah experienced. He was treated horribly, both physically and verbally. And the only reason he received such treatment was because he stood for what was right. There was a high price to pay during those days for being righteous. And that's what we're going to look at here. Jeremiah defamed, our first point. Verses 59 to 63. O Lord, you have seen how I am wronged. Judge my case. You have seen all their vengeance, all their schemes against me. You have heard their reproach, O Lord, all their schemes against me. The lips of my enemies and their whispering against me all the day. Look at their sitting down and their rising up. I am their taunting song. This here we're looking at the lies and schemes against Jeremiah. Now there are two ways that this passage has been taken historically. Now some see it as referring to Jeremiah being mistreated by his own countrymen prior to their Babylonian defeat. Some see it as referring to Jeremiah's mistreatment after the Babylonian defeat. And certainly there's a case that's made for both sides. But here in these verses, I'm quite confident that he is referring to his mistreatment prior to the Babylonian takeover. He's referring to his treatment by his own countrymen, his own leaders. The language is fitting. It was Jeremiah's own countrymen who schemed against him. It was them who spoke evil of him over and over. Numerous times they tried to have him killed. Now the Babylonians were a wicked people, but they were an openly wicked people. They didn't have to hide behind some scheme. If they wanted you dead, they killed you. They didn't need to secretly conspire against anyone. They besieged the city of Jerusalem, and when they entered it, they slaughtered a lot of people. They took captives back to Babylon, and they left the poor in the city. Jeremiah, in essence, he was simply not in their crosshairs. Therefore, I think it is best to view this passage as Jeremiah referring to his mistreatment from his fellow countrymen. He suffered terrible persecution in the hands of, like I said, his own countrymen and his own leaders. Think about this. The men who were put in charge over the spiritual well-being of Judah were actively persecuting God's prophets. Think about the moral depravity in the nation at that time. In fact, you might find some similarities to today. Jeremiah here is pleading with God to see his unjust suffering, which of course God did see, and Jeremiah knew this. He sort of gives us the image of a poor man pleading with a judge to see his case, to see the mistreatment and to condemn the evildoers. Now, it takes a very godly person with a very clear conscience to make such a request. But we need to also remember that this is not entirely a request. Just a few verses later, Jeremiah is speaking prophetically. He knows that God will deal harshly with his enemies. He knows that God already had, at that time, to some degree, dealt with his enemies. This is not Jeremiah seeking revenge from an unforgiving heart. This is Jeremiah recognizing the fact that God is going to make things right. But what exactly happened to Jeremiah? Well, a lot happened, and he deserved none of it. And I'm only going to give you 3 examples. Because Jeremiah faithfully warned Judah of their coming judgment, he was hated for it. Even the people from his own hometown plotted to kill him. Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 19 says, "But I was like a docile lamb brought to the slaughter, and I did not know that they had devised schemes against me, saying, 'Let's destroy the tree with its fruit, and let us cut him off from the land of the living, that his name may be remembered no more.'" Now, from what I understand, a docile lamb would have been considered a small lamb that you perhaps would have kept indoors, possibly even a child's pet, okay? Think of it like a puppy dog. This is obviously the most innocent of lambs. It was kept close to the family. You wouldn't expect this lamb to be slaughtered, but that is the image that is being given here. Jeremiah was a gentle man, guilty of no misconduct. He was innocent. He didn't deserve to be treated spitefully, and yet the men from his own hometown were conspiring to have him killed. And they not only wanted to kill him, but they wanted to destroy everything he stood for as a prophet. And they had no legitimate reason for this. No reason except for the fact that they themselves were enemies of God. They were enemies of righteousness. They opposed Jeremiah because their hearts were wicked. Now, our next example here takes place in the temple. Now, you would think in Old Testament that the temple was a pretty safe place for a prophet. Well, in the case of Jeremiah, it was not. After spelling out God's warning and pleading with them to amend their ways, the people demanded that he be executed. They had no tolerance for anyone who called out their sin. And we find this in Jeremiah chapter 26, verse 8. "Now what happened when Jeremiah had made an end of speaking all that the Lord had commanded him to speak to all the people, that the priests and the prophets and all the people seized him, saying, 'You will surely die.'" Instead of repenting of their own wickedness, they decided to instead kill their prophet. Because he was bold enough to call them out, they decided that he was not fit to live. They would not tolerate anyone who dared to address the nation's backsliding. It was an area that was off limits. Our third example took place near the end of Nebuchadnezzar's siege on Jerusalem. As you remember, King Zedekiah put Jeremiah in the hands of men who lowered him into a pit within the prison with the intent for him to starve to death. They accused him of treason. They accused him of defecting to the enemy. And of course, none of this was true. In actuality, they were projecting their own wicked hearts and intentions onto Jeremiah. We find this in Jeremiah chapter 38, verse 6. So they took Jeremiah, cast him into the dungeon of Malchiah the king's son, which was in the court of the prison, and they let Jeremiah down with ropes. And in the dungeon there was no water, but mire. So Jeremiah sank in the mire. Few people have ever had to endure such mistreatment. But through it all, God knew what was going on. He knew full well of the wickedness of Jeremiah's enemies. He knew about the lies that had been told. He heard their slanderous words, their sarcasm, their insults, and their mocking. He knew about every reproachful word said against Jeremiah and subsequently himself. They may not have understood it at the time, but to speak evil against God's prophet was to speak evil against God himself. Now, God is always faithful to his word. And if he says he's going to do something, he will. This brings us to our final point. Jeremiah avenged. Verse 64. Repay them, O Lord, according to the work of their hands. This is retribution for the enemies of Jeremiah. The Septuagint renders this verse and the ones that follow not as simply requests or petitions, but as prophecy. And that is the correct way of looking at these. Yes, Jeremiah seeks justice for his mistreatment, but at the same time, he knows that God would deal with them according to the law of retaliation. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some do see this as referring to the Babylonians. We have to remember that they did treat God's people with the utmost harshness. And certainly God would in time deal with that wicked nation. And they would receive a just recompense for their actions. Nobody persecutes God's people and gets away with it. Yes, from our vantage point on earth, it often appears as though they do. But in the end, they will be held accountable and they will be brought to justice. Verse 65, give them a veiled heart. Your curse be upon them. This is the most grievous curse, in my opinion. To be given a veiled heart is perhaps one of the most grievous curses to fall upon man. It is equivalent to a hardening of the heart or a covering of the heart. It results in deaf ears, blindness, and stupidity of heart. All metaphorically, of course. To be given a veiled heart would result in them being blinded to the evils that would eventually come upon them. It results in arrogance, in bullheadedness, even to the point of madness. It results in illogical thinking. Now remember, Pharaoh, during the 10 plagues that came upon Egypt, that's what happened to him. He hardened his heart against Moses, against the Israelites, and ultimately against God. And so God gave Pharaoh what he already wanted. He gave him a hardened heart. Of course, as we all know, the end result was a lot of illogical decisions. During all of this, the common Egyptian recognized that they were under a curse. They recognized that these plagues were the very finger of God. But Pharaoh, in his arrogance, refused to listen. He became so bold and arrogant that he destroyed his own country, his own army, even his own son. God had given him a veiled heart. That is what he wanted. This same curse came upon the people of Judah. It was judicial blindness. They continued in their arrogance until they experienced divine punishment. The same fate was awaiting Babylon. They too would eventually fall to a more powerful army, the Persians. And this, of course, was spelled out in Daniel chapter 5. As you remember, King Belshazzar had become arrogant so arrogant that he desecrated items from God's temple. And that night, they fell to the enemy. You know, God does sometimes use a wicked nation to chasten his people. The Old Testament is full of these examples. But the wicked nation still faces God's wrath in the end. You know, he may allow them to be used for the purpose of punishing his own people. But in the end, they will still be held accountable for their actions. And finally, verse 66. In your anger, pursue and destroy them from under the heavens of the Lord. A just recompense. You know, it is argued that at this point the writer is not only referring to his enemies of the past, but also his present enemies, the Babylonians. I do find it fitting, since the Babylonians did eventually suffer the same fate. God did eventually destroy them in anger as he did those in Jerusalem. In fact, God made a full end of them. You know, the wicked men in Jerusalem suffered terribly at the hands of the Babylonians. I mean, Judah's king at the time, Zedekiah, probably suffered the worst of all punishments because he had caused the Babylonian king much grief. He made sure that Zedekiah paid for it. And if you remember, King Zedekiah was forced to watch his own children be murdered and then had his own eyes crushed. You know, Israel and Judah, they fell under the curse because they willfully disobeyed and willfully rejected God. Jeremiah was there to see it. He watched Jerusalem face God's anger and the resulting destruction. However, as promised, God did not allow his chosen nation to remain in enemy hands. And so after nearly 70 years in captivity, the people were permitted to return to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding. Having said all that, I'm a big proponent of patriotism. And it's not just because that's how I was brought up, but it's because I see it so many times in God's word. Love for one's country is a noble thing. God has always expected his people to do their due diligence in serving the people of their own nation. You know, those conspiring against their own nation for their own lust or greed were traitors. And yet this is what they accused Jeremiah of. But when you sit down and think about it, between them and Jeremiah, who was really patriotic? You know, the leaders in Jerusalem did not have the best interest of their nation in mind. They were prideful. They were arrogant, and at times they were cowardly. You know, the fate of Judah, and most importantly, Jerusalem, was in their hands. They were not willing to do the right thing. I mean, there were times when King Zedekiah admitted that he believed the warnings from Jeremiah, but he was too cowardly to do anything about it. He was too concerned with his own welfare to give it any consideration. That man was not patriotic, and neither were the rest of the leaders. Even if they believed anything that Jeremiah had said, they did nothing about it. They were too caught up in their own interests. Now compare that with Jeremiah. Jeremiah was trying to save his own country from being overrun by an enemy. He was trying to spare his own countrymen from falling under the chastening hand of God. He was trying to turn his country back toward God. Now that was patriotism. You know, their right standing with God was the only strength that they had. It had always been God and God alone who kept the tiny nation of Israel on the map. Without him, they would cease to exist. For them to walk away from God was to disarm themselves. Of course, only a fool would disarm himself while surrounded by enemies. But that is what they did. Jeremiah knew this. He saw it coming. And that is why he continued to be a faithful prophet. That's why he continued to prophesy warning after warning, knowing that it would cause him to be mistreated. And that's why he was a true patriot. He loved God, and he loved this country. And he was willing to take a stand when nobody else would. Now, I read something the other day on Facebook, something that I found rather disheartening. And it was from a fellow believer who expressed his disgust for any preacher who would dare speak anything political from the pulpit. As he saw it, Christianity should have no bearing on your political views. Well, I've heard this before. I'm sure we've all heard this. I've heard it a lot. And if you think about this mindset, if you follow it to its natural conclusion, basically means that God's word can transform every area of your life except your political views. Now, don't get me wrong. There is a lot in politics that is merely preference. There's a lot of hills that we don't need to die on. So I'm not talking about the more trivial things. I'm not talking about gray areas. I'm talking about things that are black and white, things that are obvious, namely, that every person, whether inside or outside of the womb, is precious in God's eyes. The sanctity of life is a very big issue. The God-given rights of all people is also a very big issue. Now, some will say, and some have said, that you have to leave your political views at the door on Sunday morning. Really? Where in the scriptures is that spelled out for us? Because it's not there. The Bible is extremely political. It's extremely offensive. Read through the Old Testament. See how God dealt with various governments over the centuries. See what God thought about oppressive governments. See what God thought about nations who had laws promoting the sacrifice of children. The Bible does not cease to be the ultimate authority over our minds when we watch the news or go onto social media. We cannot call good the things that God has clearly said are evil. Now, we're all accountable for our political beliefs. We're accountable for what we believe. We're accountable for how we vote. And I want to make this clear. I'm not making this a Republican versus Democrat issue. I'm not. I see, in my own view, that there are corrupt politicians on both sides of the aisle. I believe there's corruption in both parties. That's my opinion. But I will say this, that if you are looking for a politician who believes in the sanctity of human life, you will not find it in the Democrat Party. And I am not saying this to be offensive in any way. Many of you who know me, you know that I'm not an offensive person. I have strong views, but I'm not pushy. And believe me, I'm not trying to push anything on anybody. However, historically, there had always been a great divide between the conservative view and the liberal view. There had always been a big divide between conservatives and liberals. However, in years past, both parties loved America. Both parties valued our Constitution. A lot of disagreement between the two parties used to be rather small. Now, certainly there were times in history where this divide was big. Think about the Civil War and the subsequent fight for Black American rights. That was a very big divide. And thankfully, in the end, the country was able to unite. However, in the past 5 years, I have seen a very troubling movement. A movement of radical people with a real hatred for America, for our ideals, for our religious beliefs and our principles. They seek to destroy everything this country was founded upon. They are rewriting our history. They're turning our heroes into villains. We're not a perfect country. Our heroes were not perfect. They never were. We certainly have many things in our past to be ashamed of, but thankfully we've learned from them. We are very unique. We have rights in this country that others can only dream of. We have rights that people in European countries don't even understand. And that's because we are a nation founded under biblical principles. Why else would we have abolished slavery? Think about how many countries on their own have abolished slavery. Very few. Very few. The sad thing is that these truths, they're being eroded away today. And soon there will come a generation who really knows nothing of our ideals and our uniqueness. And that certainly will be the beginning of the end for America. Now, I say all this because things are rapidly shifting right now. Leftism has become so extreme that many classic liberals no longer feel as though they can be part of it. In fact, in my opinion, classic liberals have far more in common today with conservatives than they do with the modern progressives. And that's good. A lot of people have woken up to this. Now, let me get a little more personal before I close this morning. Christians in America have long held on to a hope that since we are one nation under God, we will always be protected. And I believe that we used to be. If you look through the history of our country, you will see what I believe appears to be divine providence. God has blessed us tremendously. And one of the reasons for that is because we have always stood for Israel. But on the other hand, we mustn't forget that we are not Israel. We cannot claim God's promises that were given to them. They are very unique in that regard. They were promised a real nation in a real physical place. And God has kept that promise, and he will continue to add to it abundantly at a future time. But we do not have that same guarantee here in America. We are not promised this land, nor are we guaranteed that the government will allow us to keep our rights. If things continue going in the direction they are, we might find ourselves no longer allies with Israel. And that will be a very, very sad day, because God has pronounced a curse on any nation who goes against Israel. In fact, if things continue as they are, we might find that our First Amendment becomes regulated or even revoked. There might come a day when we will face real consequences for speaking our minds. There's a real possibility that someday soon, Kevin and myself will not be permitted to speak certain truths from the pulpit. And I think it's coming. But I can assure you, I know where Kevin stands with this. I know where I stand with this. And we're not going to be pushed around. We have every right to teach God's word in our churches. Now, you have no doubt seen the inroads that the left has made through claiming that certain things are hate speech. In fact, there's a Christian organization, I believe, last week that was suspended from social media for calling a biological male who is transgender, they called him a man who dresses like a woman. Is that not fact? Everyone knows that's fact. The progressive left knows that is a fact. Since when has it been acceptable to censor free speech here in the U.S.? Since when do we stand for that? Since when has it become a crime to speak an obvious truth? It seems to me that there's only one viewpoint that is allowed here in the U.S. And if you disagree, you might find yourself censored or even worse. If history is reliable, and it is, we can be confident that this will only continue to get worse. And what are we going to do when that happens? More pointedly, what are you going to do when that happens? The way I see it, and I've thought a lot about this, and I hate to say it, but I've already seen people who call themselves Christians who have bent the knee to this. But you have two choices. You can go along with their agenda and try not to ruffle any feathers, spare yourself any harm. Or you can be like Jeremiah and say, no, this is wrong, and I won't be a part of it. Nor will I sit by quietly and watch my own country go down the drain. Jeremiah knew the road ahead was going to be rough. He knew his righteousness would cost him dearly, but he was willing to pay that price. Are we willing to pay that price? And more pointedly, are you willing to pay that price? Are you willing to do what is right even in the face of persecution? It's easy to say yes. It's another thing to live it. Because if we continue down this road, it will probably come to that. And you'll be faced with an ultimatum. Take the easy road, get left alone, or stand up for what is right and have a target painted on your back. Right now, anyone who vehemently disagrees with the new agenda is considered an extremist. And that's not hyperbolic, that's reality. And those who are considered extremists today are simply one breath away from being considered domestic terrorists, at which point the FBI takes a very big interest in you. I believe Christians at some future time here in the U.S. are going to be called domestic terrorists. Right now, patriots are being considered domestic terrorists. It is coming. The writing is already on the wall. And each and every one of us needs to decide now whose team we're on. We need to decide now whether or not we are willing to endure any persecution for the faith. Church history is full of examples of men and women who did not count the cost of being a Christian. Men and women who did not make a conscious decision to decide whose team they were on. As a result, when persecution came, they were the first ones to renounce the faith. Why is that? Their faith wasn't real. They never took it seriously. And we cannot afford to do that. We cannot afford to be lulled to sleep by the easy living we are blessed with here in the U.S. As I said last week, Christians all across the world are being martyred at an alarming rate today. They're being tested. So far we have not had to endure such treatment. But it's possible that that day might come here in the U.S. I don't know when. I don't know to what extent it might be. But it is bound to happen sooner or later. Now, I've thought a lot about this. And I've concluded that there is nothing in this life that is more important than knowing that you belong to Jesus. In fact, I believe it is more important than life itself. So I urge each and every one of you to decide today whose team you're on. Decide today whether or not that you will do God's commands in the face of persecution. Decide today what price you're willing to pay to be called a child of God. Because I believe the time is coming when many of us are going to be tested. Joe, would you close us in prayer?